Stranger at Home, Chapter 3. In the afternoon, my mother came to find me to go fishing with her. I resented that my sisters were allowed to tag along. I wanted to have my mother to myself and tried to ask if we might go alone. I pulled at her sleeve and pointed out the door, then pointed from my sisters to their bed. She shook her head. Spit flew from her mouth as she talked about the dewbillac and pointed toward the village. I guessed that she was scared to leave the girls at home alone. My father had bundled Ernest up in the sled and taken him along on his search for wood, and I was sorry he hadn't taken Mabel and Elizabeth too. We walked to the lake near our home, called Felix Lake. We found a spot on the far shore, and my mother and sisters dropped their lines into the water. I just stood there, growing increasingly conscious of the glares from my sisters, who had noticed that I had yet to drop my own line in the lake. What if I had forgotten how to fish? What would they think of me? My mother nudged me to go ahead. I could stall no longer. I took a deep breath and followed suit, and they lost interest in me. My mother was an excellent fisherwoman, and she hauled in one lake trout and then another. She caught more than my sisters and I combined. Normally, I was a very competitive person and would have tried to outdo her, but my spirits were low. My mother noticed I was acting strangely and asked me what was wrong. I understood her question but couldn't find no words to answer her with, to explain what I was feeling. I shrugged my shoulders and shook my head. She looked unconvinced, so I jerked at my fishing line and pretended to have a nibble. Just as my mother was about to help me, Mabel squealed with delight. She had caught a fish, and I could tell it was of a fair size by the way she struggled with it. My mother turned to help her. The fish was a 10-pound lake trout. Mabel grinned from ear to ear, holding up the flailing fish for us to see. My mother patted her on the back while Elizabeth oohed and awed. It was a big fish, but I didn't think it warranted all that fanfare. My sisters giggled and chattered, gesturing with their arms, and my mother tossed her head back and laughed. They were recalling other fishing trips, other fish they had caught together. I was not part of any of it. I could not even join in their conversation. I wanted my family to be proud of a fish I had caught. I dropped my hook back into the water and prayed I would catch a fish even bigger than Mabel's. We caught more than enough fish that afternoon, though Mabel still outdid me. As we walked back toward our tent, I trailed behind with my mother, while my sisters ran ahead after a small sick that had bravely popped its head up out of the tundra. A pair of ducks scattered into the air before them, and Mabel and Elizabeth fell to their knees, searching for eggs in the grass. My mother prodded me gently, so I handed her my string of fish and ran to join my sisters. We found 4 eggs, one for each of us children, to have for support along with the fish. At least I wasn't going to starve. Between bannock, fish, and eggs, I could survive. My father was waiting for us at the site of our new home. His face was red and sweaty from work. He was carving logs he had found adrift in the ocean so that they would fit together into walls. Igloo, explained Elizabeth, using the Inuktitut word for house and pointing to my father. My brother played on the ground with a heap of small pieces of driftwood, pretending to build his own little house. My father had been raised by his grandfather in a log home. I knew that he had always wanted to build us one, but our nomadic lives had not been suited to it. Now that we were staying in Tuck, he could finally build a log cabin for us. Everyone else was excited about the house, but to me it was just one more thing that meant we weren't going back to Banks Island. After the fish were cleaned and cooked, my father came in to wash up for supper. As everyone began to eat, I decided it was time I brought up something that was bothering me greatly. "You didn't say grace," I said to father. "We don't say grace in this house," he replied. reaching for a piece of fish. But you have to. I think we should read from the Bible too. Don't you want your soul to be saved? He glared at me and brought a fist down on the table. I have read the Bible. It was the only book I had when I left residential school, and I read it twice during my first year back out on the trap line. Just stories. That's all I found in it. So you can leave that God business at the school. I do not want to hear about it before I eat. But the nuns and the priest said you're going to hell. You're going to hell because you don't know God, I cried. I don't want you to go to hell. My father ignored my pleas. He grabbed the platter of fish from the center of the table and heaped some onto his plate. My sisters looked relieved, but I felt ill. My father had read the Bible. How could he not know better? Why would he want his family to spend eternity in damnation? And what of my little sisters and my brother? I said grace silently in my head 6 times, once for each of them, and once for Uliman, because Margaret knew about kneeling and bowing and praying, but Uliman did not. I felt like a bad Christian and a bad daughter for not trying harder to convert them. I decided I would read my sisters one of the stories from my children's Bible before bed to make up for it. Despite my misery over the fate of my family's souls, I devoured an entire fish and my egg. My mother and father couldn't believe how much I ate. The pancakes I had eaten earlier that day had been far from enough to tide me over. Later, I was sorry that I hadn't eaten a second fish. For the next 2 days, I was not offered a thing that I could stomach. They were trying to force me to eat the foods I used to. It didn't seem fair. Uliman couldn't eat cabbage soup, and Margaret couldn't eat Pipsy. Over and over, I tucked my head into a book and let my imagination release my hunger pains. On my 5th morning at home, I sat at the table where my father liked to read, engrossed in one of my books, and trying not to think of the breakfast I had not touched. The book was called Gulliver's Travels and told the story of a man who traveled to faraway lands. One of the lands was filled with strange little people called Lilliputians, who imprisoned Gulliver to them. He was a giant. I wondered if the Dublac, as my mother called him, felt like Gulliver among us. I also wondered what the little people would have done to me if I had been stranded on their shores. I jumped when my mother placed a cup of tea in front of me. She gestured to the door of our tent, meaning that I should take it out to my father. I stood up too quickly, and the world tightened into a narrow tunnel and went black. When I awoke, my mother was standing over me, staring down. I rose to my feet as quickly as I was able, still feeling lightheaded. My mother grabbed me by the arm and marched me out the door. My father asked where she was taking me, but she did not answer. She was not going to argue with him about it. I was thankful when I realized that we were headed to the Hudson's Bay Company, though I felt so weak I wasn't sure I could make it. Her decision came just in time. I was almost ready to give in and eat the strong smelling, salty food that my family somehow enjoyed. My mother took me with her because she could not read and did not trust the clerk at the store. We walked up the steps of the white painted wooden cabin and through the door. As we made our way to the counter, my mother still had a firm grip on my arm to steady me. She looked to me to point out what I wanted. I shrugged my shoulders. I hated the outsider's food almost as much as our own. She let out an impatient breath and began pointing to tins and cans on the shelf behind the man at the counter, picking out things like corned beef and canned beans. They were not the sort of thing they had fed at us at the school, and I was not sure I would have more luck eating them. But I had to get something into my stomach. My mother was not about to make the rest of the family live on bannock and fish on my account. I understood that, though I knew the outsider's food was also not the answer. Just as she was pointing to some tinned peaches, something I could definitely eat, A deep, throaty cough startled us. The store was not well lit, and our eyes had not fully adjusted from the glaring sun. We had not noticed anyone else in the store besides the clerk. We turned to the sound which came from the back of the store. Here's the image on page 47. "Do Billac," whispered my mother when she saw the large, dark-skinned man standing in front of the bookcase. I could not take my eyes off the dark stranger as he fingered the books in the case, even as my mother dragged me toward the door, keeping us as far away from him as possible. My mother nearly ran down the stairs of the building, her breath short and quick with terror. Why was the grizzly-like outsider still here? He should have sold his pelts, gathered his supplies, and moved on days before. Now I would have to eat the same food as my family or starve. No peaches. Defeated, I struggled to keep up with my mother, my feet sore from wearing my hammock. When we arrived home, I went inside the tent and gorged myself on muktuk until I could not stuff in another rubbery bite. "See? I told you. When she was hungry enough, she would eat," my father said to my mother in a newly lit tin. On his way out the door to find out what was going on with the dark stranger. Somehow, I understood every word. End of chapter 3 on page 48.